Queridos, bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, boa madrugada para os corredores. Pessoal, hoje eu estou recebendo a professora Mariana Velasco-Rivera, uma das grandes e notáveis alunas da Faculdade de Direito de Yale. E a gente vai conversar sobre um assunto bem, assim, o assunto é pesado porque eu acho que o prognóstico para o México não é bom. Mas assim, a conversa ficou bem tranquila, a gente deu umas risadas em determinados momentos por causa que as coisas são bem bizarras. E a gente conversou sobre a reforma constitucional que foi feita no México. E foi uma reforma profunda para afetar o judiciário. Os caras basicamente acabaram com o sistema judicial do país do jeito que ele é e reformaram para que todas as cadeiras de juízes em todos os levels, até a Suprema Corte, sejam ocupadas por pessoas eleitas. E os requisitos para as pessoas eleitas, eles vão deixar vocês assim, rindo de nervoso. Eu acho que é a forma de melhor descrever a situação. A professora Mariana está hoje em Dublin, um professor assistente, uma pessoa extremamente qualificada. Eu já acompanhava o trabalho dela antes mesmo de chegar aqui em Harvard. E eu espero que vocês gostem da conversa, pessoal. Eu acho que está bem rica e ela traz a conversa traz alguns insights sobre os perigos de reformas que acontecem sobre o judiciário, que às vezes são necessárias, mas nem sempre são boas. Então, lembrando também que esse podcast é apoiado e sustentado por muitos de vocês. E lembrando que nosso grupo de estudos, o Ulisses Grupo de Estudos Constitucionais, está prestes a ser lançado. Eu acho que esse é o penúltimo episódio antes do lançamento do Ulisses. E os nossos assinantes, eles vão receber cupons de desconto, dependendo. Os cupons vão ser cada vez maiores, dependendo do plano que eles assinam lá no nosso Apoia-se. Então, se o Onze faz parte da vida de vocês, se o Onze ajuda a contribuir de alguma forma para o enriquecimento intelectual de vocês, cogita dar uma olhada aqui. O link está na descrição do episódio, você pode acessar lá. Vai ter planos que você tem acesso antecipado aos episódios, você pode receber livros da nossa curadoria e agora também vai receber cupom de desconto do nosso grupo de estudos constitucionais, que eu estou preparando um material assim, ó, a nata da nata da nata do direito constitucional mais atual no nível mundial, pessoal. Então, a gente vai ter conversas longas, debates pesados sobre direito constitucional, usando metodologia socrática, no sistema que eu aprendi aqui em Harvard. E eu espero que a galera aí que esteja assistindo o episódio, que goste do direito constitucional e esteja com um tempinho durante a semana para a gente conversar um pouco nesse grupo de estudos, que eu acho que vai ser muito rico. Vão ser 3 aulas por semana para as 3 turmas, para tentar alocar o maior número de pessoas. A gente vai ter aula nos sábados de manhã e nas segundas e terças à noite. E por fim, não podia deixar de mencionar meus 2 patrocinadores. Primeiro, a minha querida Contracorrente Editora, editora do meu coração, que tem seu clube do livro lá no www.quebracorrente.com.br, que está te entregando 2 livros por mês, um sempre inédito e outro no catálogo da Contra. E eu e o Bruno Cunha, a gente está planejando um negócio muito bom aí com a Contracorrente, então fiquem de olho. Não posso dar spoiler ainda, mas fiquem de olho que vai ser um negócio fantástico lá. E lembrando que você, que é ouvinte do Onze, tem na descrição do episódio aqui um cupom de desconto para qualquer coisa que você for comprar no catálogo da Contra, você tem 25% de desconto, tá lá. 11 Supremos 25 para qualquer coisa que você queira comprar do catálogo lá, e a gente recebe comissão por isso. E meu segundo patrocinador, meu querido Felipe Augusto, lá com Ouse Saber cursos preparatórios. O Ouse Saber já aprovou mais de 5.000 pessoas aí nas grandes carreiras aí dos concursos públicos, magistratura, Ministério Público, delegados, procuradores e defensores públicos. E o Felipe é um cara fantástico, lançou um livro agora, recentemente, sobre um curso de direito constitucional, que eu confio de olhos fechados. Quem já assistiu os episódios aqui do Felipe, ele já teve aqui quando era tudo mato, acho que lá pelo episódio 19 e 20, falou sobre a decisão do Supremo sobre a transfusão de sangue de homens homossexuais. Depois, lá pro episódio 42, quando ele falou do caso Lutz, que é um dos marcos do direito constitucional alemão. E, por último, ele teve aqui para falar sobre procedimentalismo e substancialismo. A gente conversou sobre Habermas e um monte de autores importantes aí e a contribuição deles para o debate jurídico. Então, quem acompanha o Felipe também lá nas redes sabe que é um cara super competente e eu acho que o Ouse pode ajudar a encurtar o seu caminho até a aprovação. É isso, pessoal. Eu espero que vocês gostem do episódio de hoje. Meu nome é Davi Sobreira e esse é o Onze Supremos. Hello, everyone. Today I receive one of Yale's finest, Professor Mariana Velasco-Rivera. But although I'm very glad to receive Professor here, we are going to talk about a very difficult subject. And Professor Mariana, with experience about her home country, although she's in Dublin right now, I think.
Yes.
We're going to talk about the Mexican judicial overhaul. Some call reform, some call a revolution, some call a dismemberment, something that we might tackle in some part of this conversation. But before we start, Professor, can you please introduce yourself for our listeners?
Yes, of course. First of all, David, thank you so much for the invitation. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here, and I hope that the conversation, your audience finds the conversation useful. So, as you said, my name is Mariana Velasco-Rivera. I'm an assistant professor in law in Maynooth University. Which is a university in the greater area of Dublin, 25 kilometers west from Dublin. And I teach constitutional law and comparative constitutional law. And my main focus right now, so my big sort of like project right now is focused on constitutional amendments in Mexico, but sort of like trying to contribute to the broader debate of constitutional rigidity in comparative perspective. So yeah, by as a way
You
of
got a book. You got a book coming
yeah,
out about this.
yes, I have a book coming out soon, hopefully in June if everything sticks to schedule, which is entitled "The Constitutional Politics of." The politics of constitutional rigidity, unveiling pathways to change in Mexico, and is published by Oxford University Press. And yes, it's coming out in June, so hopefully your audience will find it of interest as well. So
Very
that's me.
nice. Mariana, although I think people in the US might be more acquainted with what is happening in Mexico because of the proximity, but most of my listeners are back in Brazil. So let's start with a bit of context, explaining the general landscape of the political and social spectrum that led to this major change in the Mexican Constitution.
Yeah. So, if you allow me, David, I am actually, David, sorry, I'm going to be like
Don't worry at all.
switching between David and
Don't
David
worry
because
at all.
like since I'm speaking in English, yeah, that's how it goes. Anyway, so if you allow me, I'm going to also give you a little bit of background in terms of, structure of, the constitutional system in Mexico, just because I think it's relevant to understand what is going on at the moment. So it is important for your audience to have in mind two main structural aspects about Mexico's constitutional system before the judicial overhaul. So one is that Mexico is an old written and rigid constitution, which that dates from 1917, and actually, very interestingly, the constitutional amendment rule of the Mexican Constitution is very similar to that of the US. So, which is, it requires a two-third majority of the chamber of the bicameral Congress and the ratification of half of the state legislatures, which are 32, to pass any text, any change to the Constitution. So that means, again, that, it should be very difficult. Like on paper, at least, it should be very difficult to change the constitutional text. And yet, despite the similarities with the level of stringency of the amendment rules, between the comparison between Article 5 in the U.S. Constitution and Article 135 in the Mexican Constitution, the Mexican Constitution is one of the most amended constitutions in the world, with over 750 amendments. So that's the one structural point that I want you to keep in mind. So the second thing is that as you may already know, for most of the 20th century, Mexico had an hegemonic party regime. So this meant that even though that on paper the Mexican Constitution provided for a well-functioning constitutional democracy, in practice power was concentrated in the hands of the hegemonic PRI, so the hegemonic party. and in particular in the president's hands. So when it comes to amending the constitution under the hegemonic party regime, one party had control over the three branches of government. So it was easy, so to say, to access the amendment mechanism, even though that on paper, like it should have been difficult to amend. So that meant that, the president, for all practical purposes, could change the constitution at will, okay? So this hegemonic party regime started to unravel around 1970s, but the party truly saw the beginning of the end in 1988, when the PRI almost lost the presidency and for the first time did not hold the necessary majorities in Congress to amend the constitution on its own. So this meant that from 1988 onwards, if the PRI wished to amend the constitution, it needed to reach across the aisle, so to say, to compromise with the opposition. So it is in this context, so in the last decade of the 20th century, that Mexico saw the constitutional changes that were necessary to enable the transition to democracy, which included, among other things, but very importantly for our purposes, the judicial reform of 1944. Okay, so with the passage of this amendment, so Mexico joined against the backdrop of the world, the world was changing at that point in time, joined the world of new constitutionalism, which meant that the Mexican Supreme Court had been long stayed at the silence of the country's constitutional politics, was empowered with new constitutional review powers. And this amendment also sought to professionalize the judiciary to make it, truly, independent. The result of this amendment was essentially like the slow formation of, a professionalized and independent, if imperfect, judiciary, and of a Supreme Court that, with an increasingly sort of like an important role as a constitutional check on the exercise of public power. So this change took place over the span of 3 decades. It was a very a long process, and of course it was not linear or easy. But today, I think it would be uncontroversial to say that during this time, the Supreme Court and the judiciary in general had, acquired a prominent role in the enforcement of constitutional rights, as well as in the adjudication of conflicts between the government branches. So the year of, last year, the year of 2024, so exactly 30 years after the judicial reform of 1994, marked the end to that process. Okay, so in February last year, President López Obrador submitted a set of amendment proposals to essentially undo most, if not all, of what I just mentioned. So that's sort of like a very, very broad, superficial, sort of like big picture of, what we are going to see essentially being dismantled. Okay, so do you want to say something?
No, I was going to make a follow-up question. So you provided the context, the landscape. I was going to ask for the reasons, the justification, both the underlining, and what was sold to the public by Obrador and his party.
Yeah. So before I answer this question, which is a very important question, should I perhaps give your audience the main features of the judicial overhaul?
I think we can get in the next block
in the nitty-gritty. Okay.
Yes.
So it comes February 2024, and the president presents this set of amendments to, among other things, overhaul the judiciary. That's important for you to know. It's not the only amendment that was passed, but I think it's the most important because it like essentially goes to the core of, you know, the branch of government that is supposed to control how public power is exercised. So the government, the justification of the government can be understood. Like if you ask any member, you know, of the official party or of Morena, the party in government, or even the president, the current president, and the former president López Obrador, why they are doing this, the first thing that they would say, I would say, it's because they have a democratic mandate. That is, you know, they won the 2024 election in a landslide. And you know, that means that, you know, that electoral victory gives them, or essentially makes them, the ultimate channel of the will of the people, right? So whatever they decide is necessary to, you know, make the Mexico's constitutional system better. They have the, you know, the legitimacy, the electoral legitimacy to do so. So that's one thing. And that has been like a core talking point of Morena since the party came into power in 2019. So essentially, because they didn't just win in a landslide in 2024, they won in a landslide in 2018. So that's been that is to say, any changes that we put forward are, you know, can be justified because we have that electoral legitimacy. In addition to this, so one important element of that talking point is that anything that went against, or that goes against, like even today, that goes against the interest of the government and the interest of the party, would automatically be branded as something that is against the interest of the people, as, you know, as the enemy that we have to fight. And one, you know, sort of like a main actor or main one target in this sort of like narrative was the judiciary throughout the presidential term of President López Obrador. So essentially, whenever a decision was handed down against the government interests, that'll mean that the judiciary, or in general, or the judge in particular, would have a mention in the daily press conference of the president, of President López Obrador, accusing the judiciary or the judge in question as being corrupt, as being, you know, responding to dark interests.
Like what we are seeing here in the US.
Exactly. So yes, exactly like that. So that's kind of like, you know, the enemy, as in, you know, the judiciary as the enemy, was built throughout a span of at least 6 years, which was, you know, the term of President López Obrador, as always accusing them as, you know, corrupt whenever something was not in line with the government interests. And importantly, I think it's important to emphasize that here facts did not matter. The actual, you know, reasons given in the different decisions by either the Supreme Court or, you know, appellate judges or even district court judges did not matter. So the only important aspect of judicial decisions, so, you know, to justify the accusations against the judiciary, was the outcome of the decision. So whatever was, you know, useful to attack the judiciary, then it was, you know, it was weaponized against the judiciary without actually taking into account what had been decided. So that is essentially like, I think that's the main sort of like, justification and the main talking points that the judiciary, sorry, that the president and the party in government used to justify what they were doing. So if we have already built this public enemy that is corrupt, we need to we create the problem to then offer a solution, which is we should get rid of this judiciary and eh, select the judges in a more quote unquote democratic way, which is the popular election of judges.
Next question has a two-part. I think now we get in the piece by piece of the major parts of the reform, what they presented, what the government presented. And in next, I would like to talk about, at least for a bit, about how the society got the news. Because, for example, when talking to Professor Yaniv Rosnai, when he talks about the attempt of judicial backsliding in Israel, one of the things he said that we got the lesson from Poland, we got the lesson from Hungary, and we mobilized. We saw almost a year of manifestations every Saturday, people on the streets in massive numbers. And although the amendment passed, the constitutional the Supreme Court struck it down because it has at least a perceived legitimacy to do it so, both in the social spectrum and in the judicial and in the legal spectrum, because of the construction that Aaron Barak has made it throughout the years. So begin. First part, let's talk about the content of the reform and how the society and even the Supreme Court in Mexico respond to the attempted reform, at least in the beginning.
So okay, first about the content. So in a nutshell, so the judicial overhaul does a lot of things, but in a nutshell, it replaced the judicial appointment systems at the federal and state levels with the popular election of all judges. So overall, like 7,000 judges, like from, at the federal and local levels are going to be affected, but only counting at the federal level, it's about 1,600 judges, from district court judges to Supreme Court justices, which will be affected. And that total is going to be, half of that is going to be half of those vacancies are going to be subject to popular election this coming June, like in a few weeks, and the other half in 2027. And on top of that, 19 states are holding elections as well. So first of all, how we are selecting judges is the sort of like the main sort of like change. The other thing that the judicial overhaul does is that it creates a judicial discipline tribunal, which essentially has very broad powers to sanction judges, including removing them from office, except for Supreme Court justices and those judges at the
Let
electoral
me
tribunal.
just one follow up in this, Mariana.
Yeah.
What is the composition proposed for this organism? Because, for example, in Brazil, we got something close to it in a reform, but the composition is majorly from judges. So we got a bit of corporativism, so they got to protect, and we don't see many punishments. I think this is not the pretension to create such an institution in Mexico, but I think that might be important.
So the composition of the judicial tribunal. Yeah, so the composition of the judicial tribunal is also going to be selected by popular election. So that's the, the tricky, like, so the tricky part, I think this is a very important question that you are making, because this brings us to the question of how are we going to select candidates? Okay, so, and that is the actual, the actual problem that I think we should be paying attention to, and how, like, on how the system is going to work. Because again, like in broad terms, what happens? So again, candidate selections raises questions about like judicial independence, because candidate selection, as the new system, is essentially depends on three committees, so three evaluation committees that are, empowered, or, that are responsible of producing the lists of suitable candidates. Okay, and the committees are, there are three committees, and one for each branch of government. Okay, so one for the legislative, one for the executive, and one for um, the judiciary. So the idea is that anyone who wants to run for a judgeship is required to bid their candidacy to one or more of the three selection committees. And once the screening process of this, a very large number of vacancies is through, the names appear on the ballot paper, are randomly selected from, the lists that were prepared by the selection committees. But like, even though, like, in the abstract, perhaps this may sound relatively fair, because, like, names are, selected randomly, the process of how the lists are of suitable candidates are going to be crafted is essentially, or has been, at least in practice, this first attempt was essentially a black box. So in particular, when it comes to the executive and the legislative, the processes of selecting the suitable candidates were essentially, how they've been described is that they allow a lot of
Discretionarity.
discretion, a lot of discretionary power to, determine who is suitable and who is not. So that brings us to the question of, the point of, in particular with the executive and the legislative, the fear is that, those with political connections, or those with, those best connected to the political elite, are those who are going to be selected. That's the best case scenario, I would say, because the worst case scenario that we have already seen is that there are candidates with links with, with either criminal records or with links to the organized crime. So that's, very, very, very concerning. So to return to this
There was
question.
this was a problem I was wondering, and I talked to a friend here in the LLM cohort, and I asked, I think we in Brazil are experiencing a wave of organized crime, increasing organized crime, but we don't have, at least for the moment, the problem with cartels in the extent of Mexico. And I asked, a branch like the judiciary was meant, at least in the Supreme Court level, and in some degree the lower levels, to be counter-majoritarian. And when we introduce elections, majoritarian elections for these offices, what might happen is, first, as an incentive, going to law and economics, we can see what happened here in some states in the US. And I think it was John Oliver once that made the last week tonight about the elections, and judges saying, I'll be tough on crime. I'm going to give death penalty. Dude, this is not your job.
Yeah.
Judges are not supposed to have these views, to express these views. And the second problem is, when you go to elections, the problem is people like cartels might use this to entrench their members in the judiciary. And when I asked this to a friend, she said, "No, David, there is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, there is a very famous lawyer of the cartels who is running for a position in the Supreme Court."
Mhm.
I,
Yeah. Yeah, and that is, I mean, the thing is that, and that is kind of like also in my mind would be like a best case scenario because like it's the lawyer of, cartel member, but hopefully not himself is, like, but the problem is that we are also seeing people who have, criminal records. The paradox of this is that, the one of the requirements to become a judge or a like a district judge or an appellate judge or a Supreme Court justice is that you should there are you have to have a good reputation and a no criminal record, etc. And even there is a constitutional requirement that provides that you should not have a criminal record. There are cases that there are candidates that were deemed suitable by the legislative committee in this case that have criminal records. And and then there has been already cases brought to courts to challenge the suitability of those candidates. And what the electoral tribunal said is like it's too late. The evaluation committees, the relevant evaluation committee deemed this person suitable. We cannot do anything. It's crazy. And the other important point that you are touching upon is that essentially the popular election of judges, in a way, one could argue that sort of like puts the logic of the task of judging on its head, right? Because then you have to campaign for to become elected, but you they kind of like you would the question is that you have to make promises that either you will have to keep to stay popular, to then be able to keep your office when a re-election comes, or you will have to make promises to be elected and then not not keep your promises and then don't get reelected. So it's yeah, so it's a very, again, like it's we Mexico has been thrown into an era of sheer uncertainty, and we don't know what's gonna happen with the system of administration of justice in Mexico. Yeah.
let me another follow-up. Let's talk about the requirements for the new Supreme Court composition, because although the Supreme Court, as far as I'm aware, should be elected in this next election that will be held at a cost of half a billion dollars, the first election for all the judges that will be held, and another $500 million in the next in 2027. Many of the justices resign as a form of protest to what happened. So before we talked about how they tried to deal with the amendment when the amendment was passed, let me ask you what the new amendment says about the requirements and the logistics for a person to become a new Supreme Court justice. Because as we were discussing before we start, I remember Professor Gutierrez saying that he was a justice in the Supreme Court, saying that a video of him went viral twice in TikTok, because when he talked about the new requirements to become a Supreme Court justice, people, even young people who tends to use TikTok, got so overwhelmed with the idea that it's such a mockery.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, so to answer the nitty-gritty part of the question. So how do you become a justice of the Supreme Court? So first of all, the membership of the Supreme Court was reduced from 11 members to 9 members. And the requirements are, so the general kind of like, I'm going to make a blanket statement about like the requirements, the new requirements to become part of the judiciary, like either as a judge or as a Supreme Court justice, is that the requirements are, the bar is extremely low. Okay. So one of the requirements to become a Supreme Court justice is to have a legal degree, a law degree, with 8 points out of 10 your overall grade should be 8 out of 10. I don't know what would be the translation to a
In English is
GPA.
GPA. In Portuguese is about like IRA.
Yeah.
Europe.
So yeah. So, but the point is that you should be, you should have 8 out of 10 points. This might sound like, okay, so 8 doesn't sound like that bad, but like this is, kind of concerning against the backdrop of another problem that we have in Mexico, which is the lack of regulation of law schools in Mexico. So, while we obviously like have very prestigious law schools, we also have what it's called like escuelas patito, which is like it would be literally translated to.
We call in Brazil is uni esquina, university of the corner.
Oh, yeah. So it's the same idea. So essentially is, schools that you will go, like will charge you for a tuition and you will pay, and the unwritten sort of like agreement would be like you would get a degree once, the time passes as long as you pay. But like there's no kind of like quality standard of the education that people are getting there, the legal education. So that's a big problem because essentially anyone with the means to pay for this would be, able to, kind of like tick that box in the requirements list. The other thing, very concerning thing about the requirements is that to become so the amount of professional experience that is constitutionally required to become a Supreme Court judge. You require 5 years of experience. In it's the phrase in Spanish that they use is in the legal in la actividad legal, so the legal activity. So for Supreme Court justice is 5 years. For appellate judge is 3 years, and for district court judge is 0 years.
So technically, someone who just got out of law school with his 22, 23 years should wait only 5 years to be eligible to become a Supreme Court justice with 28 years.
Yes.
I can't mock that because in Brazil we got the bar at 35 years in 1988 when we drafted the constitution. I think it should be higher, but we got this in at 35 when the life expectancy wasn't that high.
Yeah.
Although it's not a good idea, I can't mock this without being hypocritical. So
Yeah. There
but
you
I
go.
think there's more coming.
Yeah, no, yeah, and then again, like I don't like it. This is not to say that, younger people are by definition unable to, hold hold high office. Like that's a different discussion. But I think that, context is always important to assess the rules that we are looking at. And again, against the backdrop of the, reality in Mexico in legal education, 5 years without, like only 5 years to become a Supreme Court judge is nothing, I would say. Like it's very little. And again, like this also raises questions about, like what's the impact on the independence of those becoming holders of these offices. But then the other The other requirement is that you should write a 3-page essay to, stating the reasons why you want to become a justice, but also you need to submit five letters of recommendation, which can include your neighbors or any people, like any person that can endorse you. So again, I wish so, and this is the reason why Justice Gutierrez went viral in Mexico, because he said in that video, like, I wish I was kidding, or something like he said, like, I wish I was kidding, but I'm not, and like I also wish I was kidding, but the word, letters of recommendation from your neighbors, so the word vecinos, the word neighbors in Spanish, is in the constitutional text. Um, so that's another thing, like that's kind of, I think it's a mockery. Like it's like I will go if I want to become a judge, like I would go and ask my parents to write a letter of recommendation.
The problem is, you can try to argue that, oh, why is someone in high office should a letter of recommendation of someone in a high office worth more than your neighbor? They are all citizens. So, in kind of a democratic way out, someone might try to argue that, but again, it's like what you said, context. You are trying to assess one of the highest office in the republic, and people are saying, "Oh, who is vouching for you?" "Oh, my neighbor." Okay, who is it?
Exactly, exactly. And this is important again because one one of the things that we should not forget about, the like constitutional adjudication and in general like adjudication is that like it involves very high uh, like highly skilled it's like highly skilled job, like it's a difficult job. Not anyone, like, I mean, anyone who has the preparation to do it, like, could do it, like, like, I'm not saying that by definition, like, there's only a certain group of people that can do it, like, no, but you need preparation to do it. You need preparation to, the same as you need preparation to be a doctor and to, operate on people. You need preparation to, be able to conduct constitutional adjudication, because it's not an easy job. um and the fact that, the Mexican Constitution is kind of like deeming enough for 5 people who know you personally to vouch for you as, as someone who is suitable to conduct such a important task for also for the functioning of a constitutional democracy, is a mockery. Like, like, skills are important in many professions, like, and the legal profession is one of those. So we have to take it seriously. And the Constitution, as it is now, is not taking it seriously. So yeah.
Mariana, when the amendments passed, one of the things that happened was it was judicialized in the Supreme Court,
Yes.
and the Supreme Court tried to do what the Israeli Supreme Court did in January 1st, 2024. They tried to strike down the amendment, but the problem is there, as far as I'm aware, there's nothing in the Constitution of Mexico, or you can please correct me, that is the humanitarian clause, or is it?
No.
So the problem is there is no express view, the express provision that says that the court has its power. So it was an attempt to inaugurate the power of striking down unconstitutional amendments. Can you please explain how the court reasoned this idea and tried to do it, and why it couldn't reach the outcome of striking down the amendment?
Yeah. So another question that like requires context, a broader context. So one important thing that we, like your audience, should know about how the Supreme Court has treated the question of the unconstitutionality of constitutional amendments is very important. So the Supreme Court, for over, throughout its history, like for at least, 40 years, has considered that the power of amendment, so, is above the law, to, to put it in a nutshell. So essentially, it has considered that anything that is done, like any constitutional amendment, is again like sort of like channeling the will of the constituent power. So there is a concept in Mexican constitutional theory, which is known as the permanent constituent power, which is again the power that is exercised through the amendment mechanism. So, or how it works, so how the concept works in practice, or the implications of that, of understanding, the amendment power as, the channel through which the constituent power, expresses its will, is that anything that is adopted in the Constitution, anything that is enshrined in the Constitution, is not subject to judicial scrutiny, or any kind of scrutiny for that matter. So that was kind of like the first hurdle that the court in 2024 had to deal with. How do we deal with our, actually our own presence of how we have understood this power historically? And that was, I think, the major obstacle, which, by the way, the court, like in his opinion draft, the judge that was proposing to consider the amendment parts of the amendment unconstitutional, actually ignored. So they didn't actually own their own presence. So that was, I think it was a mistake. But in any case, it didn't matter, because what happened in when the challenge was brought to the court, and that suddenly it was kind of like signal that they were going to, against all odds, basically based on that historical aspect that I just explained, against all odds, the Supreme Court was going to strike down parts of the constitutional of the judicial overhaul. One other mistake that I think it was made, in fairness, it was part of the court's practice, was that they published the opinion draft that was, proposing to strike down parts of the judicial overhaul. They made it public a week before the hearing. So what that caused was obviously that the government, like everyone, was essentially, like, in that week the court was under fire, like under constant fire. There was actually, I think it was like more than a week, because they also passed, so another constitutional amendment was passed to actually prohibit the explicitly constitutionally prohibit striking down a constitutional amendment, so the judicial review of constitutional amendments. So again, because of that, the court was under very heavy fire in the lead up to the hearing. And then when the hearing came, importantly, so again, like, hopes were high, because there was a block of 8 judges formed, that everyone was hoping they were going to vote in favor of the opinion draft that was proposing to strike down parts of the judicial overhaul. And how did we know that it was a block? Because the days before, again, in the lead up of the hearing, 8 of them, so out of the 11 judges, handed down their resignation letters to, to take effect after the election takes place, after the new court takes office. But in that way, kind of like they signaled, one, that they were not participating in the judicial election, so they were not, they had no skin in the game anymore. And B, that they, were going to just leave whenever, whenever the court, they were not going to be an obstacle for the new system to start working. So in that way, they, in my view, they kind of like neutralized many of the like sort of like one of the arguments that the party in government were making is that like they didn't have, and now, the legitimacy to decide on that question, on the constitutionality of the judicial overhaul, because they couldn't be impartial. So again, like by resigning, you are neutralizing that, because they're like, by doing that, you have no skin in the game anymore. So when, again, like these 8 justices, so the Mexican Constitution before the judicial overhaul required 8 votes, to 8 out of 11 votes to strike down legislation. So, by having that, the resignation letter of these 8 justices, so the hopes were high that there was a qualified majority to strike down the parts that the opinion draft was proposing to strike down. And then it came the hearing. And early on in the, during the hearing, one of the judges, justices, Justice Perez Dayan, says that he is, so first they were deciding on questions of admissibility. So you have to decide whether you can, move on to the merits. So in admissibility, one of the 8 judges, Justice Perez Dayan, says this case is not admissible. Signaling that, so the question was like, okay, so if he's saying like it's not admissible, it's kind of like, well, at least in my mind, it was like, it's obvious that he's not going to vote, in favor of striking down the relevant parts of the amendment. So I think that was a reading of the Chief Justice, because after realizing, so again, importantly, the question of admissibility, so procedural questions are decided, or were decided by simple majority. So that meant that technically they should, like, you should have moved to discuss the merits of the case. And technically, like at least in theory, Justice Perez Dayan could have changed his mind, on the merits. But instead of moving on to the merits, because there was a majority to move on to the merit, to discuss the merits, Chief Justice Piña decides to ask those in the minority, so those voting against the admissibility, how they were going to vote on the merits. And this was an unorthodox move. And like, even if you push me, it was an irregular move, because it's not in line with court proceedings to ask justices to tell them how they're gonna vote without, before actually discussing the relevant issue. So she asks that, and Justice Perez Dayan says, I'm going to vote, against the proposal, against striking down the judicial overhaul. So then the Chief Justice Piña decides to then take a vote to dismiss the case instead, because, when if there's no majority, when, the qualified majority to strike down legislation is not met, then the case is considered like to be dismissed, so to say. So as if, it never happened, so to say. So that's what happened. That's why, we didn't get to hear actually, we didn't get to hear the arguments. Yeah.
Mariana, there are 2 other provisions that I think reinforce the idea that we were discussing. In constitutional theory, I think, as we talked about, there are three different theories that explain what happened in Mexico. We got constitutional replacement, constitutional revolution, constitutional dismemberment. In a nutshell, all of them are saying the same thing. We are seeing a reform that breaks with the spirit, with the unity, with the core, at least one of the core elements of the Constitution that was created. It breaks with, at least in a part, with the identity of the Mexican Constitution. Two provisions, besides all of those we are already discussed. Two other provisions caught my eye. The first one, that it is one that bars the court from reviewing other constitutional reforms, and the other is one that limited the scope of, I think, the writ of amparo. So, can you please explain the idea of the amparo and what have changed and what is expected to become of it, and the idea of the limitation to review constitutional reforms as they passed?
Yeah. So the amendment to prohibit the judicial review of constitutional amendments is the one that I mentioned while I was explaining the whole debacle of the Supreme Court almost, or the attempt to strike down the judicial overhaul. That was passed after the judicial overhaul. That is a different amendment, and it was because when the party when
It was
Morena.
a response to the mobilization of the court.
Yes. So essentially it's the direct response to the real possibility of having this proposal opinion draft being published that would strike down a constitutional amendment. So again, this is not to say that in the past, like there was no attempts to to challenge the constitutionality of constitutions, but of constitutional amendments, but there was kind of like this sense. I would argue that that the political elite was very kind of like sure that the Supreme Court was not going to meddle with what they were doing in the Constitution, because of this concept of of how they understand the power of amendment, and this concept of the permanent constituent power. But when the judicial overhaul comes, and again, like what the judicial overhaul did is in no way comparable to the most abusive things that the today's opposition did in the past. Though I will argue that in certain cases, like there are cases that should have been struck down. But given the depth and the gravity of the overhaul, the possibility of the court actually striking down was very real. So that's why, like, I think that the government considered that amendment trying to prevent the court from from striking it down. That's why they adopted this amendment. So again, it's a response to the possibility of the court striking down the overhaul. And then, so the amparo. So the amparo is, essentially the individual constitutional complaint mechanism. So for most of its history, the effects of decisions in individual constitutional complaints had effects only inter partes, so only the parties involved were the ones benefited or affected by the relevant decision of the court. But in 2013 there was this change to give to open the possibility to give general effects to, certain decisions in individual constitutional complaints. And there was a process, a specific process to be able to do so. And what the judicial overhaul does is, to backtrack or to roll back that possibility. So that's, in a nutshell, what it's doing. Yeah. I think, one of the reasons why, the government would be interested in, sort of rolling back that possibility is that, at least um, by, having only these inter partes effects, the judiciary, you're kind of like tying the hands of the judiciary in a way, because it won't have, an effect on the overall policy that it's been questioned. And in the cases where, norms, like legal provisions, are being challenged, it won't affect the policy overall, but it's only, limited to very individual cases. So that's kind of like, another way to limit the power of the judiciary.
Mariana, sure,
Yes, I
continue,
actually
please.
didn't. So I
Sure.
was going to say that I didn't respond to your question about the social mobilization, the response to the judicial overhaul. So if I want to address the question, because it's important. Like, in fairness to students, many students across the country, like law students, went, took on the streets to protest against the judicial overhaul. And in the days, in the weeks and months before the lead up to the passage of the amendment, and during, when it was being discussed in Congress, it was very, I mean, in a way, heartening to see that, the young people going out to the streets to protest this. Even there were, so in the day during the day, when the Senate was about to pass the amendment, there, like, people actually broke into the Senate premises. Um, Trying to, kind of like prevent from like the pass prevent to prevent the passage of the overhaul. But the only thing that happened is that, like, the Senate changed, venue, and it was passed anyway. And also during the, like, the when the state legislatures were um, in the process of ratifying the overhaul also. There were protests in state legislatures, but no, like, nothing of that mattered to stop the party in government. The other important thing that happened also in terms of, response, was that the judiciary, so members of the judiciary, went into strike, and went out and, like, protests as well against the overhaul. But again, the sad part, like, and in comparison to what happened in Israel, none of that mattered, because, I mean, again, when you have kind of like, so yeah, my reading of, like, the sort of like the lack of impact of this protest is that, the party was very well aware that they had the control of the narrative, in the country, through, again, like, I think it's like we are not emphasizing enough, or I'm not emphasizing enough, the power of the daily press conferences of the president. Like, instead of having your press secretary, as it happens, in the US. I don't know how it works in Brazil, but having the president, being it in a daily press conference that goes about, like, 3 hours each morning, setting the agenda every single day for 6 years, is not to be underestimated. Um, and I think that's, that's the reason why it, even though that we saw like social mobilization against it, it wasn't enough.
Mariana, looking ahead, a prognosis, if we are able to do some futurology. I remember there's a critique from Professor Amartya Sen to John Rawls' veil of ignorance in that development as freedom. And this is quite good when we take the critique to look to seemingly neutral laws and add some context to it. So technically, as we see a system of free and fair elections that all they're interested might get a chance. But as you explained, there's context. There are people with affiliations to cartels that will get more power. There are people in the black box that will get backup from their political connections. What are the political analysts and the scholars saying about what to expect from these elections that are to come? Who will get elected and what is expected of the judiciary as a whole in Mexico after this?
What is to be expected? So I think the one feature that people keeps coming back to is uncertainty. We don't know, and like because we are the first country in the world to do something like this, we are, like at a general scale, we don't know, like we don't have any, anything to any previous experience to, sort of like set our expectations. So that's one thing. Like, we don't know. Um, so based on the based on previous experience of, having an hegemonic party in, in government, an hegemonic party system, and how elections were determined or how people were like was elected back then. So essentially was, if you are well connected within the party, then the relevant sort of like organizations that are important to the party are going to endorse you. So I think we are going to be back, and this is something that has been mentioned by Professor Ana Laura Magaloni, about, like we are probably going to see the different unions that are very important for the government, sort of like the teachers union, or the unions that the oil company union is also like very, numerous, and like this kind of like, very corporate like way of working. So if you are the candidate that is endorsed by this big organizations, then you will probably, get elected. So again, trying to, take out our ball, like our crystal balls. I think that the people that we are going to see elected are the people who are well connected in in the party. That's in the best, again, in the best case scenario, so to say, because I think the worst case scenario is very like it's very grim, in the sense that like it would be seeing people with a criminal records or or linked with the organized crime elected. Um, Again, because cartels have also that corporate nature, they have power of organization, and they, in the end, are also comprised by citizens that have the right to vote. So Yeah, like I don't know. Like this is obviously like it's a difficult question, but again, the best case scenario that I just portrayed is not a good it's not a good scenario, but like I'm just saying that it's very worrying. Yeah. So again, and our like and then just like a final note, like that also, the sort of like the elephant in the room against that backdrop is, what does that mean in terms of the impact on judicial independence and, in general, the administration of constitutional justice in Mexico.
Mariana, uh, every time I wrap up an episode, I always say that I'm glad that I received the person and I let the doors open so we can talk. I hope we are able to talk and again in the future about a different subject, something not so dark, not so heavy.
Yes, hopefully, yes.
Yeah, but I would like to open the final block for final remarks that you want to make. I always leave a list of references, and of course, I'm going to leave. Although the episode is coming about, I think, a month or two before the launching of the book, the episode will be available on internet. So sometime in the future, people might be getting to hear or to watch this, and they will be able to look to your book in the list of references. Any other
Yes.
final remarks?
No, nothing. Just to thank you for the invitation. It was a real pleasure to talk to you, David. And yes, and hopefully we can repeat this with probably maybe a less dark dark topic. Yeah.
Mariana, thank you very much for your time. And I hope we don't take too long to talk again.
Yes, me too. Thank you so much.